What's up, AP Psych? Welcome back. This is our final video of the brain and our final video of Unit 3 of Biological Psychology. This video is going to focus in on our more recently evolved brain structures, more specifically the cerebral cortex and the lobes and hemispheres that make it up, and all the information that goes with it. This is what separates us from all other species in terms of intelligence. So we're going to get to it and talk about that. Again, hopefully you have your notes out. Take your time. A lot of detailed information about the brain. A lot of new concepts that you might not be familiar with. So let's get started. The cerebral cortex, that's the outermost layer of something called the cerebrum. So all of these little folds here that you see on the brain, this outermost layer here is the cerebral cortex. Just within that is something called the cerebrum, which is like the center brain. And this accounts for about 80% of the brain's total mass and does most of the sophisticated information processing in the brain. This sets humans apart from other species like we mentioned before. It's a tight-knit connection in terms of neural connections here that allows fast processing and higher order thinking to take place. So the structure of the cortex, each brain hemisphere is divided into 4 lobes. They're almost identical in each hemisphere, and they're separated by some prominent fissures that separate each part and help us delineate which parts of the brain are responsible for which behaviors and mental processes. So the 4 are the frontal lobe, which is in your forehead, right here in this area. The parietal lobe, which comes about on the back top of your head. If you're wearing maybe like a headband or something, you pull it back there. The occipital lobe in the very back of your brain, responsible for our vision. And the temporal lobe that wraps right around your temporal area, right? So we're going to discuss those 4 lobes and the things that they are responsible for and the cortex and association areas that are involved. The first, that frontal lobe, it controls functions like judgment, planning, producing speech, sounds, emotions, controlling your emotions, your personality, your temperament. And it also works with movement because of something called the motor cortex, which we'll get to in a second. But this brain structure, your frontal lobe, this area, is one of the last to develop in life, right? So you teenagers sitting out there listening to this, you know, the reason we're so emotional, we struggle with our temperament, our personalities are always changing. It has a little bit to do with the hormones, right, from our endocrine system, but a lot of it is due to the fact that your frontal lobe isn't fully developed. So some of those choices that you make on the weekends that maybe you regret, or those emotional outbursts that you have, it's because your brain is still developing. So, you know, next time you get in an argument with your parents, you say something irrational or you do something that maybe they ground you for, you can remind them, hey, my brain isn't fully formed yet, so I have an excuse to do these things. Okay, that's your frontal lobe. Okay, a lot of our judgment, planning, personality come from there, and movement aspects. Here's a case study that told us much more about the frontal lobe, and this is kind of how we discovered its relevance to personality and temperament and judgment. The story behind Phineas Gage. In 1848, Gage was a respected, polite railroad foreman who was working to clear a path on the rails. So he's kind of the lead guy, getting all the debris, you know, blowing things out of the way so they can build a railroad through. But he's known as friendly, good dude. Everyone liked him. And he's filling a hole with dynamite. It was what they called a tamping rod. So this 3-foot long rod that you could pound dynamite into a place that you wanted to clear and blast away so you could build the railroad. Well, it exploded on him while he was tamping down the dynamite. And that rod went straight up into his head, entering just beneath his left eye through his cheek, and exiting through the top of his skull, right? The amazing thing was that he'd survived the accident. And he didn't seem to have any speech or motor difficulties, and his memory was completely intact. But he had lost about a teacup full of brain matter, right? Which you'd think, man, that should take anybody out, right? And especially back then in 1848, how could you survive that? But he did. But the one thing that they noticed was that his personality was completely changed. He became difficult to be around. He was short-tempered. He often said inappropriate things. He couldn't censor himself or his emotions. He couldn't keep a job because his personality was so greatly changed. And what this case study told us, that frontal lobe damage prevented him from censoring his ideas, his thoughts, or his speech. And it totally changed him as a person and his personality. And that's how we started to learn that, maybe different parts of the brain are responsible for different aspects of our behavior, of our mental processes, of our functioning. So Phineas Gage was a great case study, a natural lesioning, right, of the brain, which told us, we kind of understand what the frontal lobe might be used for now. And here's Gage. You can get some pictures of what happened and kind of see the severity of it. That's that tamping rod. And his skull afterwards was donated to a museum. You can see him when he was alive holding the rod, went through his cheek, out through the top of his head. That's a 3D image of it. And in the classroom, if you want to check it out, I have a 3D printed version of Phineas Gage's head, skull, after the tamping rod had blown through it. So that gave us a lot of insight into the functions of the frontal lobe. Associated with the frontal lobe is something called the motor cortex, and it's largely responsible for the voluntary movement of the parts of our body, right? It's located in the back of the frontal lobe, this area right here. Okay? It's right on the border, the division between the frontal lobe and what's called the parietal lobe, which we'll get to next. Okay? If part of the motor cortex was electrically stimulated, it would cause that part of the body to move. And they've done a lot of research on that, determining which parts of the motor cortex control which parts of the body. And movements that are precise or delicate are controlled by considerably larger portions of the motor cortex. So that's how they discovered that. Stimulating these different parts showed us that larger portions were responsible for precise, controlled movements, right? And one way that that is shown in the scientific community is something called a homunculus. Maybe you've heard of this before. This is a motor homunculus, and this is a visual representation of if our body mirrored our brain in terms of the amount of area occupied by each part of our body in our brain. Okay, so let's try to say that another way. Our hands, very precise, delicate movements, right? Very complex motor movements. They take up a large portion of our brain and our motor cortex. Our lips, tongue, producing speech, that's also a very complex motor movement, right? So if our bodies mirrored this, our hands would be huge, our lips, our tongue would be massive, right? And the rest of our body would be very small, because our hands, mouth, tongue, those things take up much more space in our brain because they are much more precise, much more delicate. They take a lot more neural connections to make happen accurately, right? And that's the motor cortex. It's responsible for those type of movements and helps us communicate and do what we needed to do on a daily basis. Our next lobe is called the parietal lobe, and that's just towards the top back of your brain, right here. It's responsible for things like body position and spatial reasoning. So when we talk about the idea of kinesthesis, something that we'll get to eventually, as well as vestibular sense, things like that, that body position and spatial reasoning, this is the parietal lobe's job, okay? It also deals with touch, pressure, temperature, pain, and that comes from something called our somatosensory cortex, okay? And that is on the borderline between the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe, okay? We'll get to that as well, talk more about that. But the parietal lobe has a big part in our body position, spatial reasoning, where we are in space, how our body moves, as well as the information coming in through touch, pressure, temperature, and pain. That sensory cortex, which we just mentioned, is just here in the front of the parietal lobe, on the borderline with the motor cortex and the frontal lobe, okay? Right there. This is largely responsible for perceiving touch and pressure on parts of the body. I know you think senses, you think five senses, but the sensory cortex really deals with touch and pressure, and that's its main job. If a part of the sensory cortex was electrically stimulated, it would cause the person to feel pressure on that part of their body, right? And that's how we know which sections of the sensory cortex correspond to which sections of our body. The more sensitive the area, the greater the area of the sensory cortex is dedicated to it. So we just saw a motor homunculus. This is a sensory or somatosensory homunculus, right? It seems very similar in its structure because our hands are very sensitive to pressure and touch, right? Temperature, pain, as are our lips, our mouths, right? Those things are all very sensitive. So if our body structures corresponded to the area they took up in our brain, hands would be massive, lips, mouth, things like that. Other areas blurred out here, I'm sure you can imagine, also very sensitive, right? So they would be larger as well. How we found this out, we did some fMRIs, functional magnetic resonance imaging, and they can show you when someone's experiencing pain, this green area here, that lights up, right? And that pain is lit up in the somatosensory cortex because it's responsible for our helping us identify pressure, pain, touch, things like that. And here in the center of the brain, that is the emotional response that's occurring when you experience pain. Okay. So that's the responsibilities of our somatosensory cortex, largely touch and pressure, pain and temperature as well. Our third lobe of the brain is the temporal lobe that runs right along your temple, aptly named. And this makes sense when you think about the location, is responsible for hearing. It has our primary auditory cortex within it. And it also stores long-term memories and deals with speech and language understanding. So hearing, obviously it's close to our ear, our auditory canal. It's a short trip to get to the temporal lobe to process that information. And it's also close to the hippocampus, which helps us form new memories. And it's a short trip over once they've made that trip from the short-term memory to the long-term to be stored in the temporal lobe. Speech and language understanding are also in this area, and we'll talk about a couple other association areas that help make that happen. Okay. And here is a visual representation of the auditory cortex. Very small, but again, it's right on the borderline between the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, right? And then you also have your motor cortex here and your somatosensory cortex here. So those association areas are close to one another. Our fourth and final lobe of the brain is called the occipital lobe. In the back of your skull, right? If you feel that bump on the back of your head there where the brainstem kind of comes in, that right there is where your occipital lobe is. It is primarily dealing with all aspects of vision and has our primary visual cortex. That is the job of the occipital lobe. While other lobes have many different functions and jobs, the occipital lobe is really solely responsible for vision and all the aspects of vision. So each piece of the visual cortex corresponds to a particular place on the retina. The retina is the back of your eye, which we'll get into more when we talk about sensation and perception, but it's the back of your eyeball. And each part of that visual cortex receives only information from that specific place on the retina. The pieces are later put together to form the whole, right? So all these pieces are pixels, maybe you can think of them like that, of information come in through your eyes, and they go through the process of coming through the auditory or the optic nerve, I should say, and making their way back to the occipital lobe. And there, those images or those pieces are put together so we can form a whole and we can actually see the world around us, right? That's the reason you're seeing this slide right now, is because of the work done, your retina taking in the information and your occipital lobe processing it to put it together into something that makes sense so you can perceive. That's the primary job of the occipital lobe, vision. So here is a great representation of the lobes of the brain. I would say take some time here, label that brain that's on your notes. Take some time, make the divisions clear, label the motor cortex, the somatosensory cortex, the auditory cortex, your visual cortex. Include those in your diagram so you can easily reference and remember those things. Just take this in for a moment, maybe snap a picture if you need it as we continue. So I mentioned there would be a couple other association areas that I wanted to touch on involved in the lobes of the brain. So these association areas are uncommitted areas of the cortex that are involved in higher mental functioning. These areas integrate, interpret, and act on information from the sensory/motor areas, right? So they're there to help our brain process and work through higher functions of our brain, right? There are some of our later aspects of our brain to evolve. And again, they set us apart from other animals on Earth in terms of our higher mental functioning. So the first of these areas is named after a guy by the name of Paul Broca. It's called the Broca's area. It's in your left frontal lobe, right here. Okay. And it directs muscle movements involved in speech. It allows you to form and use your mouth and tongue to create speech, right? In addition to that, you have the Wernicke's area, which was coined by Carl Wernicke, or named after him. It's in the left temporal lobe, back here, okay? And that's involved in language, comprehension, and expression. Okay? This allows you to understand language coming in, and then eventually respond to it thanks to your Broca's area. Okay, so let's look at this situation here in this image. We'll say this is a teacher speaking to a student or asking them a question. She asks the question. It comes in the ear through the auditory canal and goes through the process of transduction, which is something we'll talk about in sensation and perception. But it allows those sound waves to be transduced into brain waves, right? So your brain can then understand it, and the Wernicke's area allows you to comprehend what's being said. So once you understand that the teacher's asking you a question, now the student is going to respond, right? And the Broca's area allows him to plan those muscle movements involved in speech and help with the production of that, right? So from the Broca's area, the information about how we want to respond goes to the motor cortex and then comes back out as speech, right? And that's the process. And then the same exact thing happens with the teacher, right? So the Broca's and Wernicke's area, we'll do some interesting things in class to see what happens if you damage these areas. You can't understand what people are saying. It comes in as incomprehensible language. Or if your Broca's area can be damaged, you have trouble producing the language that you want to produce. And oftentimes you use words and terms that you don't intend, and so others cannot understand you in turn. All right, so that wraps up our lobes of the brain and the talk of the cerebral cortex. What we're moving on to now are the hemispheres of the brain. And there is seemingly in popular psychology this idea that one hemisphere of the brain is responsible for certain aspects of our personality, while the other hemisphere is responsible for other things, like are you left or right-brained? And that's kind of a misconception because the two halves of the brain work together. And while there is something called hemisphere dominance or lateralization, they are not solely responsible for many of these things, right? So there's no such thing as a left-brained or right-brained person. It can be a metaphor for certain things or a way to describe people, but it's not necessarily scientifically true. So the hemispheres. The two hemispheres are roughly mirror images of one another. Okay? And this is an interesting part about the brain. You essentially have two independently functioning brains in your head, your left and your right hemispheres. The only reason they communicate is because of this brain structure called the corpus callosum right here. And you've seen this before in our brain structures notes. but it connects the two hemispheres so that they can share information and develop responses and actions that need to be taken and communicate across hemispheres, right? Whatever occurs on one side is communicated with the other. Now, another interesting part of our brain, whatever occurs on one side of the body is communicated with the other in a crisscross fashion, right? So your right hemisphere controls the left side of your body and vice versa. Same thing with your eyes, right? Information in your left visual field is processed in your right brain, your right hemisphere. Information in your right visual field is processed in your left hemisphere. So there's this crossover of information, which is kind of interesting, which many people don't know until they take psychology, that the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, and the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body. Now let's get into a little bit here, the hemisphere lateralization or dominance that I talked about earlier. So while no one is left or right brain specifically, and they don't take on independent roles from one another, there are certain things that seem to be specialized or dominant in each of the hemispheres. Okay, so I want you to think of this as your frontal lobe down here, and this moves towards the back of your brain, your occipital lobe. Okay, we're going to talk through some of these things. So in your frontal lobe, your right hemisphere seems to be dominant for things like geometry, sense of direction, distance, mental rotation of shapes, things like that. Okay. While there doesn't seem to be any specialty or dominance of spatial ability in your left hemisphere. Okay. In terms of language, your right hemisphere takes on the emotional tone of speech and helps you identify and evaluate the emotion in someone's speech. While the left hemisphere is about speech in general, you speaking, your grammar rules, reading, writing, arithmetic, right? That's on the left side. When we talk about memory, nonverbal memory seems to be stored or more dominant in your right hemisphere, whereas verbal memory is in your left. Okay. Hearing, non-language sounds and music, so things that don't have to do with the production of speech, those are in your right hemisphere, and language sounds are in your left hemisphere. So hopefully you're starting to see a little bit of a trend, a lot of language, verbal, speech, production of language and communication in general on the left, right? Whereas you have more spatial awareness and emotion on the right. And finally, with vision, geometric patterns, faces, emotional expression, and an interpretation of those things are more right hemisphere dominant, whereas words and letters are a little bit more left hemisphere dominant. Okay, so take some time, record these on your outline so you know the difference in the dominance, the lateralization of the two hemispheres, the things that they take a little bit more responsibility with in your day-to-day functioning. A couple more things. So we're going to move on to something called the brain's plasticity, or a phrase you may have heard of as neuroplasticity. So we know our brain is sculpted by our genes, but more and more we find out it's also sculpted by our experiences. It's both nature and nurture, in other words, right? And the more it's used, the more connections that we make. So plasticity refers to the ability of the brain to form and reorganize synaptic connections, especially in response to learning or experience or following injury. Right? There's amazing stories, and plasticity particularly is more effective or seen even more in young children who've had brain injuries or things like that. Different areas of the brain compensate for areas that have been injured or that are for some reason not functioning appropriately, right? There's stories about young people who have had to have something called hemispherectomies, where they have an entire hemisphere of their brain removed for a certain reason, but they can still seemingly function as normal because of brain plasticity. The other half of their brain takes on those functions that the other half would have had it was there. And it's a pretty amazing thing, neuroplasticity. So really it gets back to what we talked about towards the beginning of the year with having that growth mindset, because the more you practice something, the more you do something, the more connections you make, the stronger those connections become, and your brain can physically change as a result. So here's a quick little graph that kind of shows you with synaptic activation. That means you're doing some type of activity and your neurons are beginning to signal and send information across the synapse. If you have weak activation, does not change the synapse. Nothing happens, right? If you start to learn a language like Spanish and you never practice it, if you don't use it, you lose it. It's going to go away because your brain isn't making those connections. It's not going to stick. However, frequent and strong activation leads to synaptic changes in the structure, and the neurons become more efficient and those connections strengthen. You get better and better. Practice makes perfect, right? So the implications of this, learning needs ongoing reinforcement, right? Anything that you do that you want to become better at, you can with practice and purposeful use because of neuroplasticity. Your brain can change in response to injury. It can compensate for those injured parts, or it can change in response to learning and experience and become better at those things that you want to do. It can physically change the structure of your brain. Our very last thing, there is something called a split brain procedure. And this is a procedure in which the two hemispheres of the brain are isolated by cutting the connecting fibers. And those connecting fibers are the brain structure that we know of as the corpus callosum, right? Now, this is usually only performed in cases of severe medical necessity, and usually in cases of severe epilepsy, right? In seizures. And that's when you have too much brain activity happening. There's too many signals being sent back and forth, and it causes people to seize, right? So by severing that corpus callosum, it kind of calms down your brain's communication and really, really aids in stopping the seizures caused by epilepsy by calming that brain down and lessening the signals that are being sent from hemisphere to hemisphere back and forth. Okay? But obviously, this split brain procedure does sever the connection between your left and right hemispheres, so they can no longer communicate. Like we mentioned before, they are like two separate brains within your skull, and the only thing that allows them to communicate is that corpus callosum. Now, by severing this, most people, you'd never notice that their corpus callosum is severed. They can behave generally just like anyone else. You're not really going to notice it unless you ask them to do specific tasks. There are some side effects of a split brain procedure. Okay, so with the corpus callosum severed, here's an example. Objects presented in the right visual field can be named. Objects presented in your left visual field cannot be named. I want you to think about that for a second and maybe see if you can come up with why, right? So if I have a baseball in my left visual field and I can only see it with my left eye, that information, remember, because of crossover, goes to my right brain. Now, why would I not be able to say that I have a baseball in my hand? If you think back to Wernicke's area and Broca's area is responsible for speech production. But where is that in my brain? It's in my left frontal lobe, right? So because my corpus callosum is severed, the information from my left eye that goes to my right brain cannot travel to my left hemisphere for me to speak what I have in my hand. So I could know it, but I wouldn't be able to physically say it. If I asked that person to draw the image, they'd be able to do it. They just couldn't say it, right? And that's the interesting thing about split brain patients. They do have two separate brains in their head. And if you put things into certain visual fields or in certain hands, right, that sends information to only one half of their brain and the other side cannot communicate. So in certain instances, they could know they're experiencing something, but not be able to verbalize it because there's no communication there between hemispheres. Okay, so this kind of wraps up our brain structures, our brain notes, our cortex and hemispheres and lobes. We're going to do some demonstrations in class to help you go through split brain procedures, help you with hemisphere lateralization, and differentiate the lobes a little bit as well. Okay, so I know this is a lot of information, a lot of biology here. We try to keep it only to what you need to know for that AP test and to give you enough context to move forward successfully. But if you have any questions or you need anything, as always, please let me know, and I'll see you in class.